It all began with a deal so quiet, so hidden behind closed doors, that most people never even realized it shaped their entire lives. The clothes you wear, the phone in your pocket, the prices at your grocery store, all of them are touched by a single, powerful system that runs the global economy. A system built not on gold, not on productivity, but on oil and the US dollar. This is the story of the petrodollar, America's most secret and powerful weapon. But here's the twist. It's also a trap, because the very system that made the United States rich and dominant could one day be the reason it falls. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? It is always fascinating to see how global this audience is, because the story we're about to uncover affects every single country, every single currency, and every single person watching right now. So comment below with your country and the time. And let us begin this journey into the oil empire that built modern money. Let us rewind to the early 1970s, a time when America's economic dominance was starting to crumble. For decades, the US dollar was as good as gold, literally. Thanks to the Bretton Woods Agreement, every dollar was backed by gold, and other currencies were tied to the dollar. The US printed the world's reserve currency, but it had to be careful. It couldn't print more dollars than it had gold to back it up. That was the promise. But then came the Vietnam War, social programs, and massive spending that drained America's gold reserves. Other countries began to notice. They started trading their dollars for gold, and by 1971, President Richard Nixon made a historic move. He ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. Overnight, the dollar was no longer backed by anything. It was just paper, fiat money. But there was a problem. If the dollar was just paper, why would the rest of the world keep using it? Why would other nations accept a currency that could be printed endlessly by the US government? America needed a new anchor, something valuable, something every country needed. That anchor was oil. You see, oil isn't just another commodity. It's the lifeblood of modern civilization. Without oil, cars don't move, planes don't fly, factories don't run, and economies grind to a halt. Every nation on Earth needs oil, and that gave America an idea. In the early 1970s, U.S. officials quietly reached out to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in the world. The deal they struck would change history. Here is how it worked. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. That meant that if Japan, France, or India wanted to buy oil, they first had to get dollars. In return, the US promised to protect Saudi Arabia, militarily, politically, and economically. It was a simple deal with massive consequences. Soon, other oil-producing nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. And just like that, the petrodollar system was born. Now, think about what this means. Every country on Earth needs oil, and every barrel of oil is priced in US dollars. That means every nation must hold dollars to buy oil. So they need to earn or borrow those dollars somehow. And how do they get them? By trading with the United States, by buying US debt, or by participating in the global dollar system. In other words, America exported not just its money, but its monetary system. The dollar became not just a currency, but a global necessity. This gave the US an extraordinary advantage. Because the rest of the world needed dollars, America could print as many as it wanted. It could run huge trade deficits, spend trillions, and still have other countries buying its debt. Countries like China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia bought U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively loaning America money so they could keep the dollar flowing and the oil trade running smoothly. The U.S. could live beyond its means, and the rest of the world paid the price. But remember, every system built on power hides a weakness. The petrodollar made the U.S. the center of global finance, but it also trapped it in a cycle of debt, inflation, and dependence. Because when your entire economy relies on the world demanding your currency, what happens when that demand starts to fade? In recent decades, cracks have begun to show. Nations like Russia, China, and Iran have started looking for alternatives, trading oil in yuan, rubles, or even gold. Regional alliances like BRICS are challenging dollar dominance. Central banks around the world are quietly buying gold again, just like they did before Bretton Woods. It's as if history is circling back, warning us that no empire's currency lasts forever. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand the full trap of the petrodollar system, we need to look deeper at how it changed not just the global economy, but geopolitics itself. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about power, military power, political influence, and economic control. When every country needs your currency to survive, you gain leverage. The US could impose sanctions, cut nations off from the global banking system, or freeze assets with the stroke of a pen. It turned the dollar into a weapon, a silent tool of empire. And yet, that power also meant responsibility. The US had to keep oil markets stable, maintain the trust of foreign nations, and ensure that dollars remained valuable. But can any nation truly control a system this vast forever? we're only just scratching the surface, because the petrodollar system didn't just reshape trade, it reshaped entire governments, wars, and revolutions. Behind every oil crisis, every Middle Eastern conflict, and every financial panic of the past 50 years lies a deeper truth, one built on the flow of dollars, barrels, and promises. The petrodollar system didn't just transform the global economy, it quietly redrew the world map. Nations that had once risen and fallen through war or conquest began rising and falling through control of energy and currency. To understand this, you have to see how the oil-dollar link turned into a silent engine of power. Every drop of oil sold in dollars strengthened America's global influence. The U.S. no longer needed to occupy countries to control them. It only needed them to keep using its money. After the 1970s deal with Saudi Arabia, American power took a new form. The U.S. military protected the Persian Gulf not only to defend allies, but to defend the petrodollar system itself. Every base, every carrier fleet, every strategic intervention, all ensured that oil kept flowing and that oil stayed priced in dollars. Without this guarantee, the global demand for dollars could collapse. For Washington, protecting the dollar was protecting its empire. This system created strange alliances. Some of the richest oil states became the closest partners of the United States, not because of shared values, but because of shared interests. The U.S. offered security. The oil kingdoms offered stability in the dollar market. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE recycled their oil profits, called petrodollars, back into American assets. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds, real estate, and weapons. This recycling loop kept interest rates low in America and funded government deficits. In return, the U.S. ensured their regimes stayed safe. It was a quiet bargain. Oil for dollars, dollars for protection. But every system has winners and losers. The petrodollar system made the United States richer, but it made other countries vulnerable. When a nation depends on dollars to buy oil, it depends on U.S. monetary policy. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, the cost of borrowing dollars rises everywhere. If the U.S. prints more money, inflation spreads globally. Developing nations often face a cruel choice: borrow expensive dollars to buy energy or cut spending and risk recession. The petrodollar created a world where America's financial decisions ripple across every border. We saw this clearly in the debt crises of the 1980s. As oil prices rose and the Federal Reserve hiked rates, many countries in Latin America and Africa couldn't repay their dollar-denominated loans. Their currencies collapsed, their economies shrank, and millions fell into poverty. The global financial institutions, dominated by the United States, stepped in with rescue loans. But these came with strict conditions: privatize industries, cut public spending, open markets to foreign investors. Many of these countries never fully recovered. The petrodollar system had turned them into permanent debtors in a dollar world. Meanwhile, inside the United States, cheap oil and global dollar demand allowed the government to spend freely. Deficits didn't matter because foreign nations were eager to buy U.S. bonds. Americans enjoyed cheap imports and easy credit. The dollar's global role masked the real cost of living beyond the country's means. Inflation was exported abroad. Wealth was imported home. This structure gave Washington a powerful tool: sanctions. Because almost all international trade passes through the dollar system, the U.S. can block countries from accessing it. Iran, Venezuela, Russia, all have faced this weapon. Once cut off from dollar clearing, a nation struggles to pay debts or sell exports. It becomes isolated from the global market. The petrodollar became not just a currency system, but an enforcement mechanism. The U.S. didn't need armies everywhere. The threat of losing access to dollars was enough. But as the decades passed, cracks began to appear. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan strained America's finances. Oil-producing nations started questioning why they should continue relying on the dollar. Russia and China began signing energy deals in their own currencies. Even Saudi Arabia, the original pillar of the petrodollar system, has started trading oil with China in yuan. These moves are small, but symbolically they mark a shift. Once nations realize they can settle trade without dollars, the entire structure starts to wobble. There's another problem. The petrodollar system ties the dollar to oil demand. When the world moves away from oil, toward renewables or electric energy, demand for dollars could weaken. Every new green energy policy, every climate treaty, slowly chips away at the foundation of America's financial dominance. If oil loses its central role, the dollar loses part of its global anchor. That's why energy policy is also monetary policy. The two are inseparable. Think about what this means for ordinary people. When your country's currency falls, when fuel prices rise, when debt becomes unbearable, part of the reason is baked into this global system. The petrodollar is invisible, but it shapes every paycheck, every loan, every economic crisis. It rewards the center and drains the edges. The system looks stable until one day it isn't. Many economists believe that as the world becomes more multipolar, the petrodollar's grip will loosen. But transitions like this are never smooth. When the British pound lost its reserve status to the dollar after World War II, it triggered years of turmoil. If the dollar loses its dominance, we could face something similar, but on a global scale. Currencies could fluctuate wildly, trade could fragment, and nations could scramble to find new anchors for their wealth. Some argue this shift has already begun. In 2022, the share of global reserves held in dollars fell to its lowest level in decades. Central banks are quietly diversifying into gold, yuan, and other assets. The rise of digital currencies and regional trade blocs could accelerate this trend. If that happens, the U.S. may find itself trapped by the very system it built, a petrodollar world without the same demand for dollars. And yet, the U.S. still holds a key advantage: trust. For now, investors still see the dollar as safe, liquid, and reliable. But history shows that no currency keeps that trust forever. The British once believed their pound was untouchable. The Romans thought the denarius would last forever. Every empire makes that mistake. We're now standing at the edge of a new era. Oil still flows, but power is shifting. The same forces that built the petrodollar are slowly eroding it, and if the system unravels, the consequences will reach far beyond Wall Street. The petrodollar's rise reshaped the global balance of power, but its potential fall could be even more disruptive. To understand what happens next, you have to look at how deeply this system is woven into every aspect of modern finance. The US dollar isn't just a currency. It's the backbone of trade, credit, and investment worldwide. Roughly 80% of all global oil transactions still happen in dollars. Over half of all foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars. Even when two countries trade goods that never touch American soil, they often use dollars to settle the deal. This dominance creates demand for US debt, allowing Washington to borrow endlessly at low cost. But it also creates fragility. If that demand starts to fade, the entire financial structure could tremble. Let's trace this to its origins. After the 1973 oil crisis, Western economies faced stagflation, high inflation, and low growth. The deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia wasn't just about oil, it was about restoring confidence. By agreeing to sell oil only in dollars and reinvesting profits in U.S. assets, the Saudis made the dollar the world's energy currency. This quiet pact turned America's weakness into strength. It allowed the U.S. to run trade deficits without consequence. Dollars flowed out for imports, then came back as foreign investment. This loop became the engine of modern globalization, but every engine runs hot. As global trade expanded, so did dollar-denominated debt. By 2025, over $13 trillion of debt outside the United States was owed in U.S. dollars. This means foreign borrowers depend on American monetary policy they can't control. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it tightens financial conditions worldwide. Nations that borrowed cheap dollars suddenly face higher repayment costs. Their currencies fall, inflation rises, and capital flees to the safety of U.S. assets. The stronger the dollar becomes, the more pressure builds on weaker economies. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that often ends in crisis. That's why some countries are searching for a way out. China has spent years building alternatives to the dollar system, creating its own payment networks and signing bilateral energy deals in yuan. Russia, cut off from Western banks, has turned to gold and digital settlement systems. Even the European Union has discussed creating a rival reserve asset to reduce dependency. But these efforts face obstacles. The dollar's strength isn't just economic, it's institutional. America's deep, liquid bond markets and strong legal framework make it hard to replace. Trust, once earned, is slow to move. Yet history shows that once cracks appear, shifts can happen fast. Consider what happens if global demand for dollars falls by even a small amount. The U.S. would face higher borrowing costs as foreign buyers retreat. Interest rates would rise, straining households and businesses. The government, accustomed to cheap credit, would struggle to finance its debt. Inflation could spike if Washington tries to print its way out. For a system built on confidence, even a whisper of doubt can echo loudly. The petrodollar doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, trade by trade, as countries choose other paths. There's another danger hidden in plain sight: the transition to green energy. As nations phase out oil and gas, the petrodollar's foundation weakens. If energy no longer flows through dollar channels, America loses one of its key levers of global influence. The shift to renewables might look like a climate policy on the surface, but beneath it lies a monetary revolution. Each solar panel and wind turbine quietly reduces demand for dollars. The U.S. may still dominate finance for years, but its monopoly on money for energy is slipping away. This isn't the first time a global reserve system has faced collapse. Before the dollar, the British pound played the same role. It financed global trade, funded empires, and symbolized trust. But by the early 20th century, Britain's debts and military commitments outgrew its economy. 2 world wars drained its gold reserves. When the U.S. emerged stronger, the world shifted to the dollar. It didn't happen overnight. It took decades of slow rebalancing. But once confidence moved, there was no going back. If history repeats, the next transition could be even faster in an age of instant capital flows and digital trade. For everyday people, these shifts feel distant until they aren't. If the dollar weakens globally, imported goods become more expensive. Inflation rises, savings lose value, investment markets turn volatile. The stability most people take for granted depends on invisible global trust. When that trust fades, everyone feels it. The petrodollar system has allowed the United States to live beyond its means, but it has also tied the world's prosperity to one nation's fiscal discipline. If that discipline breaks, the fallout won't stay within American borders. Some analysts believe the end will be managed, not chaotic. They expect a gradual diversification, part of reserves in dollars, part in yuan, part in gold. But transitions like this rarely follow a plan. They happen when crises force hands. If a major oil producer decides to fully price energy outside the dollar, or if a financial shock triggers panic selling of U.S. assets, change could accelerate overnight. What once looked like an unshakable system could suddenly look outdated. The irony is that America's greatest strength, global demand for its currency, is also its greatest weakness. The more dollars the world needs, the more the U.S. must supply. That means endless deficits, endless borrowing, and endless debt. It's a privilege that can't last forever. Once confidence fades, the privilege turns into a liability. Every empire that controlled global money believed its dominance was permanent. Every one of them was wrong. The petrodollar built a world of convenience and control, but it also built fragility. Beneath the surface of every transaction, a question is growing louder. What happens when oil no longer needs the dollar? When that answer arrives, it won't come from Washington. It will come from the markets, quietly, suddenly, and irreversibly. Every empire tells itself its money will last forever. The United States is no different. The petrodollar system has worked so long that it feels permanent, a global rule rather than a political deal. But the truth is simple. Every currency order is a story of power, not destiny. The US dollar became dominant because America had oil, strength, and trust. If those pillars weaken, the story changes. The cracks are already visible. The question is not if the system changes, but when. Look at how trade is shifting. China has signed dozens of bilateral agreements to settle energy purchases in yuan. India and Russia are exploring local currency trade. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are pushing to build an alternative settlement system. Each of these moves chips away at dollar demand. They seem small in isolation, but together they point to a world where the dollar is no longer the only game in town. Even traditional allies, like France, have started experimenting with yuan-based transactions. What once would have been unthinkable is becoming routine. For Washington, this trend carries deep consequences. The U.S. government runs large deficits every year. Those deficits are financed by issuing bonds, promises to pay back debt in the future. Foreign buyers, especially central banks, have long been eager to purchase those bonds because they need dollars for trade. If they stop buying, the Treasury will face higher borrowing costs. The Federal Reserve can buy some of that debt, but doing so injects more money into the system, increasing inflation risk. This creates a trap. Raise interest rates to attract buyers and risk a recession, or print money and risk inflation. Both paths are dangerous. The petrodollar also ties global liquidity to U.S. policy. When the Fed tightens, global markets contract. When it loosens, asset bubbles form. This cycle has defined every major boom and bust since the 1980s. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global meltdown, the 2020 pandemic response, all were shaped by dollar flows. As the world grows more multipolar, countries are questioning why their fate should depend on one central bank's decisions. The resentment is real, and it fuels the search for alternatives. History suggests transitions in monetary order come suddenly, not gradually. The gold standard collapsed in 1971 after years of quiet strain. The pound's dominance ended after World War II when Britain could no longer defend it. The same forces could end the petrodollar era: debt, war, and lost confidence. No one can predict the exact trigger. It could be a geopolitical conflict that reshapes alliances. It could be a financial crisis that forces central banks to dump dollar reserves. It could even be technology, digital currencies, blockchain networks, or new payment systems that bypass traditional banking. Once a credible alternative appears, the shift could cascade. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed what economists call the exorbitant privilege. It can borrow in its own currency, print money without fear of collapse, and shift the costs of inflation abroad. That privilege allowed it to finance wars, fund welfare, and sustain consumption far beyond its production. But privilege breeds complacency. America's share of global output is shrinking. Its political gridlock undermines trust. Its debt now exceeds GDP. When a nation's obligations grow faster than its capacity to meet them, faith becomes fragile. The petrodollar depends on faith. Once doubt spreads, the system trembles. Ordinary people rarely notice these shifts until they explode. In Weimar Germany, in 1923, citizens thought they were safe until their money became worthless overnight. In the 1970s, Americans watched inflation erode savings as confidence in the dollar faltered. If a similar loss of trust happens today, the shock would be global. Investors would flee to gold, commodities, or digital assets. Interest rates would spike. Stock markets would tumble. Trade would slow. The U.S. might be forced to choose between austerity and inflation, a choice no democracy makes easily. This is why understanding the petrodollar matters. It isn't a conspiracy, it's a system of incentives. Nations hold dollars because they need them, not because they love them. That need was built on oil. As the world changes energy sources, the foundation shifts. Once demand falls below a certain point, the feedback loop breaks. The U.S. loses its ability to finance endless deficits without consequence. The global financial system loses its anchor. What replaces it is uncertain. It could be a basket of currencies, a digital standard, or even a return to commodity backing. But whatever comes next will reflect a different balance of power. There is still time for reform. The U.S. could strengthen its fiscal discipline, rebuild manufacturing, and invest in innovation to sustain confidence. It could work with allies to create a more stable, multilateral system. But history suggests great powers rarely adjust voluntarily. They adapt only when forced by crisis. The challenge is recognizing the warning signs before it's too late. The petrodollar trap is simple. The U.S. must keep running deficits to supply dollars to the world, but each deficit weakens faith in the dollar. It's a loop that feeds on itself. For now, demand remains high, but confidence, once lost, is hard to regain. Every empire that relied on financial power, from Rome to Britain, believed its system would endure. All were wrong. The U.S. is not immune. When oil no longer flows through dollars, when countries no longer trust American debt, when the system built in 1974 finally gives way, the world will look back and see the pattern. A system born from crisis